Chi-Town, yeah.
Drama.
What?
Purchase your tracks today.
Windy City. Saludos. You already know. It's your host, Gabe Morales, coming back for another episode of Chicago Gangs. In the previous Two Boys episode, I discussed some of the drama they had between a similar named gang, the Two Sixers. I also relayed while not a lot has been documented on the Two Boys, other than what has been reported by one of their founders, there is more documentation on the 2-6 gang, including by my co-author, Joe Sparks, who often dealt with 2-6 gang members when he worked with Chicago PD as a gang detective. The 2-6 gang was founded in about 1970 in the South Lawndale area known as the Little Village. The story of how the 2-6 started actually predates that time, when in the late 1960s, a small group of boys started a baseball team called the Five Stair Steps. These kids went to McCormick Elementary School in the neighborhood. At the time, the boys were only 11 to 12 years old. I do not think they played in Little League. I think this was more of a loose-knit local baseball team. By 1970, the boys in the group numbered about 20 members, still played softball. They often hung out at 26th and Sawyer, which is not far from the McCormick School. At the time, Ridgeway Lords and Latin Kings were growing larger in size and became more aggressive in their recruitment. This led the boys to have conflict with both of those groups. The Kings' headquarters in the little village was on 24th and Marshall. The Yalla boys were supplied drugs by their dad, Alfonso Sr., who operated a clothing store. On the first floor was his business, but on the second floor is where the real money was made. And this happens sometimes with businesses. I'm definitely not saying all Latino businesses are this way, but some will use drug sales because, as any new business owner knows, a lot of money is needed to get a business up and going. A lot of times they feel they'll only sell drugs temporarily. I personally know this is the case. If you read my book, The Life and Times of a Vato Loco, you will hear about at least one of those incidents. So it was up on the second floor of the clothing business where the Yala boys hung out with their relatives and friends. One of Alfonso Sr.'s nieces married into the Montemayor family. The Montemayor family was headed by Matias, Benito, Bernardo, and Manuel Montemayor. The Montemayor family was connected to large-scale Mexican drug traffickers. They moved dope from Mexico to Texas and into Chicago and other cities like Detroit. They ended up facing prosecution in the early 1980s over heroin trafficking, but they had been engaged in that long before via Teddy Sweetwine Ordinance. By 1975, the 2-6 boys were in their late teens, but they looked and acted much older. They often hung out at the Sugar Lounge, located at 26th and Sawyer. A second chapter of the 2-6 began in 1977 in the Little Village. This began with the arrival of Teddy Sweetwine Ordinance, who was only 26 years old at the time. Teddy had just moved from a South Chicago neighborhood and was a member of the Bush Nation gang, and he was known to be very tough and became a major drug dealer for the gang. Sweetwine became a legend. It's even rumored that he fought with several police officers at once on more than one occasion. You can see him here in this picture, and you can kind of tell he was wild even back then. Al Sr. did have cartel connections via the Montemayor's, but as far as the Mexican Mafia connections, there was a California Mexican Mafia, but it has never been alleged that his connections came from California. And there was no Texas Mexican Mafia yet in the 1970s, only the Texas Syndicate. And this is probably the connection that some people are pointing to. In the late 70s, Alfonso Ayala Sr. moved out of the little village into the suburb of Westchester, Illinois, but he continued to run his business in the daytime in the little village. And the boys continued to use the second floor as their headquarters. This was a time of great expansion for the 2-6. In 1977, the 2-6 began expanding in K-Town and in the western part of Little Village, bounded by 26th on the north, 32nd Street on the south, Pulaski Road on the east, and Costner Avenue on the west. They also opened up a dark side 26 branch. Then the 26 moved into an area around 38th and Albany in the Brighton Park community. This would become one of their more notorious sections, and the 26 were perhaps one of the first Mexican street gangs in a predominantly white neighborhood, as they fought with white greaser clubs. And they often clashed with insane popes. The 26 also opened up a faction in the Gage Park neighborhood at 59th and Rockwell. It was in this area that the 26 battled Ambrose and Crown Town Latin Kings. This section did not last long and closed down within a few years. By the late 1970s, the 26 had grown from the original faction into multiple factions. They became powerful enough to go head to head with the Latin Kings, who were probably the most well-known Latino gang at the time and still are today in Chicago. On August 31st, 1979, Alfonso Jr. was shot to death, leaving the 26 leadership to his younger brother, David. This is when the 26 really took off and became well-known in that part of Chicago, even though David was only in his teens. He was good-looking, smart, had his own car, lots of money, and plenty of girls. He was very popular, and this is something that many teens strive to be even today. Only one thing, his power was built on the world of drugs. Then, about 16 months later, on January 25th, 1981, Alfonso Ayala Sr. decided to watch the Super Bowl game at Bonnie's Tavern, located on Karloff Avenue. That afternoon, two black males were seen standing around the corner after they pulled up in their car. The two males entered Bonnie's Tavern through different doors, and one of them, identified as Clayton Rockman, asked the bartender where the bathroom was. And a short time later, he and the other man gunned down Alfonso Sr., then fled through the side door. So this had all the indications of a hit. Rockman was later arrested and convicted of the murder. There are some people who say that was a hit by a crooked Chicago PD officer named Charles Wilson. Wilson was imprisoned in 1982 on allegations of taking bribes from heroin dealers, and it is said that Ayala owed Wilson money, and when he didn't pay, that Wilson may have killed him. But I have no proof of that. That's just rumors out on the street. During the 60s and 70s, the 26 fought with the Latin Kings. They also fought with Ambrose, Satan Disciples, and other gangs. They earned a reputation for holding their own. Joe Sparks recalls the 26 became increasingly violent, became a major active force out on the streets. They were largely Hispanic, Latino, but they also allowed other races to join. He also remembers the Latin Kings causing a lot of trouble back in the 70s, and it stated that the Kings and 26 still beef, and that there may be peace in the Middle East before the Kings and 26 ever make peace. Joe also told me that they're rumored to have some Texas syndicate connections, and if you look at their logo, it very closely resembles the Texas syndicate copia. Check out my first episode on Texas prison gangs for more on that. Also, there have been 26ers identified in El Paso and in San Antonio, Texas, both places which had heavy Texas syndicate connections at one time. Rivals can attest that David Ayala was what they describe as being a badass, and he earned his reputation for being a good fighter. But most who knew of his reputation did not even dare to go up against such a kid. This is another trait that young male teens look for today. They want people to fear them, if not respect them. But what they don't understand is when you're king of the hill, many people are jealous of you, and they will try to take you down so they can be the new king. It's constant drama, and you're a walking target. David traveled with his homeboys to different parts of the city as he saw his organization grow, largely due to drug sales. You see, they supplied heroin, and heroin out of control at that time in Chicago. By 1981, David Ayala was able to purchase his own home in the suburb of Westchester so he could be near his mother after his father died. It was shocking to many that a young 18-year-old had enough money to buy his own $160,000 home, which would probably be close to $1 million today, with its own swimming pool, and he owned a Buick Electra with personalized license plates that read El Jefe, the chief. In the newspaper and in court documents, it is alleged that David Ayala held a meeting at his suburban home on August 16, 1981, and discussed a way to wipe out Latin kings that were giving him problems. It is alleged that after these discussions, the 2-6 saw some Latin kings at Piotrowski Park, located on West 31st in the Little Village neighborhood. Obviously, police had some informants, and informants can lie, especially to take the heat off themselves. But it is said that Ayala loaded a van he owned with a shotgun, machine gun, a rifle and pistol, and that Ruben Palomo and James Soto headed to the park where a baseball game was being held and got ready to take out their Latin King victims, allegedly on orders from El Jefe. When they arrived, they parked the van in the alley behind the park. The two shooters then got out and stormed the park, firing bullets into the crowd, striking 3 people. 2 of them died. This is documented in The People versus David Ayala. The 2 that died were not members of the Latin Kings, but the one that was wounded was allegedly a king. In October 1981, Ayala was arrested, then convicted of the murders in 1983, and sentenced to spend life in prison without parole. Many of his supporters contest that Ayala was ever involved and that this was all a police setup using unscrupulous informants. Ayala himself has long professed innocence and said that he was too smart to make such a sloppy, obvious plan. David Ayala has been incarcerated all of these years. Although long ago he stated he was no longer the leader of the 2-6, many still look up to him. Others say that he went crazy while he was locked up in Tams, which is a prison that has since been shut down for being cruel and unusual punishment and due to numerous lawsuits. Despite being a newer organization, the 2-6 gang were invited into the Folk Nation Alliance in 1978 because they had started doing business with gangster disciples, and they were able to supply the GDs with a lot of dope. And the GDs needed these connections to make money, to sell drugs by their members or via associates in the drug network. It was also said that they often did hits for each other to throw the police off. This is when the 2-6 took on the name Gangster 2-6. Due to the Folks Alliance, many times 2-6 would get along with Ambrose, the 2-2 boys, and Satan disciples. At that time, you even often saw their tags together on walls, not crossed out, which is a key indicator whether they're allies or enemies. By 1980, they opened up factions in Cicero and Joliet. In Cicero, they settled around 19th and Cicero Avenue, just outside of the Grant Works section. It was there they began to war with Noble Knights and 12th Street players. By 1984, this section of 2-6 became very developed and well known as Cicero 2-6. After Ayala was locked up, the 2-6 continued to be influential out in the street. I spoke about an incident in the Ambrose and 2-2 Boys episodes that was a major event that would change street gang politics forever, November 7th, 1986. As I described in the Ambrose video, on November 7th, 1986, 2-2 boys from Cicero were invited to a party that was being thrown by an Ambrose at 63rd and Rockwell in the Marquette Park neighborhood. When the 2-2 boys arrived at the party, they were informed of another Ambrose party being held on South Washtenaw. Later that night, as the Cicero 2-2 boys were partying with Ambrose at 63rd and Washtenaw, there was a knock at the door about 12:30 a.m., shortly after midnight. When the door was answered, Jason Gray started shooting at party guests. Then Manuel Bobe, aka Little Hulk, started shooting. 4 people were shot, and 3 of the 4 were killed. Some of those killed were 2-2 Boys gangs members, and some were just associates. After this 1986 shooting, the 2-2 Boys and Ambrose went into a full-scale war with the 2-6, despite the fact that they were all part of the Folk Nation. And like I said in the Chicago introduction video, folk will fight folk, and peoples will fight peoples. In the early 1990s, 2-6 expansion grew out in suburbs like Schaumburg, Romeoville, Bolingbrook, and Hoffman Estates. They've continued to engage in wars with Latin kings as well as their former folk allies, such as Maniac Latin disciples, as well as La Raza and party people. Many 2-6 were killed in all of these beasts. They even had a war with the gangster disciples. They got really vicious around Cicero, Illinois. This was all in spite of the fact the 2-6 were part of the original Spanish gangster disciples concept that I talked about earlier. In the year 2000, police conducted Operation 26 that swooped up some of the most active members. In 2014, 2-6 in Indiana were hit with a RICO indictment. And in 2017, nearly 50 members of the gang were charged with various drug and weapons crimes. In 2014, Francisco Smokey Sanchez was arrested. He was with a well-known organization called Ceasefire. When he was arrested, approximately 120 illegal firearms were seized. Now, this is a big problem with some of these intervention programs. A lot of these former gang members are not former. They are still active. So you have to be real careful when dealing with them. This case reminds me a lot of the Hector Marroquin case in No Guns. Marroquin and his son were affiliated with 18th Street. You could check that video out for more information on that. But I know of many examples where intervention programs have been infiltrated by bad guys. More recently, in 2020, when there was a lot of looting going on in many parts of Chicago due to the Black Lives Matter protests, the Latin Kings, 2-6, and other gangs were portrayed as protecting local businesses from looting. The younger 2-6 continued to do rap video shoots and release these videos which diss rival gangs and which then result in continued shootings. Today, the 2-6 remains active in and around Chicago and other states. Thanks once again to ChicagoGangHistory.com for your well-done research on these gangs. Don't forget to purchase your copy of Chicago-Based Gangs, Beyond Folks and People, written by myself and Joe Sparks, retired Chicago Police Department gang detective. Our book can be purchased on Amazon.com and other platforms, and it can be ordered from any major bookstore. As always, please take care of each other and stay safe. Until next time, this is Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, cops, and politicians.